Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the Symposium titled Logotherapy for the Suffering from Cradle to Grave, from the perspectives of birthing, disability, trauma, and loss. This symposium is being organized by Dr. Cynthia Wimberley from Victor Frankl Institute of Logotherapy. And our presenters include Dr. Janeta Tansey, Gail, DeMasi, and Dr. Gerald Bishop. Without further ado, let me hand the time to Dr. Cynthia Wimberley. This symposium will last for about 50 minutes, and I hope that we can use the last 5 minutes for questions, and you can type it in the chat. Okay, welcome, Dr. Wimberley.
Thank you. I'm looking to see if I can get the slides. Is there a way to share the slides, share screen?
Yeah, share screen.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. Currently, all 4 of the presenters are active in the Logotherapy Institute. And so since we have about an hour, I'm going to move through the information very quickly so that the other 3 can also present. But one of the things I like to do is to start just very briefly with the background of who Victor Frankl was. And I know his name has been mentioned many times during this conference. And so again, this will be very brief. But Dr. Frankl was born early part of the 1900s in Vienna. As a young man, he grew up in the Jewish sector of Vienna and so came into contact with both Dr. Freud and Dr. Adler. As a young man, he corresponded with Dr. Freud and has the unique distinction of having his writings published in both Dr. Freud's journal and Dr. Adler. As Dr. Frankl moved into his medical studies and as there began to be more disagreement between the schools, as Dr. Adler was not sure why was asked to leave Dr. Freud's society. Dr. Frankl went with him, and then later the same thing happened in that Dr. Frankl was expelled from Dr. Adler's. As most of you are aware, it's during this time that he began to focus on what became known as logotherapy. One of the interesting things I always like to emphasize is logotherapy as a theory was developed before World War II. He had written his first draft before he ever went into the concentration camps. And so, according to Dr. Frankl, it was during the camps and during World War II that logotherapy was tested, not that it was developed. When he was released from the camps, he worked again on his manuscript that was taken from him, and it has become known as The Doctor and the Soul in the English translation. But the work that he is most widely known for is Man's Search for Meaning, which was written immediately after the concentration camps. I'd like to give a little bit of background on this as we go through this, because in the conclusion, I hope to bring some of the personal experiences that he had into line with the theoretical, and very much the concept that he who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. The basic concepts of logotherapy is life has meaning under all circumstances. And so Dr. Wong has written on this extensively and has developed his research in conjunction with what he did learn also from logotherapy and expanded it. But this philosophical underpinning, if you will, I think is so valuable during the pandemic at this time. As truly internationally, we are dealing with the same suffering and the effects of the pandemic. For the logotherapy community and for those who are living life regardless of the pandemic, and we'll talk about suffering, life has meaning. In addition, the second foundation piece is the will to meaning is the deepest motivation for living and acting. And the third tenet is that we always, regardless of the circumstances, have the opportunity to find meaning, to change a meaningless situation into one with meaning, regardless of those circumstances. And again, I'll go through these very quickly. Key to these is Dr. Frankl's concept that we as a human cannot be divided, but we talk about it for a conversation piece, for explanation, that we have a physical body, we have a psyche that entails our mind, our emotions, and so on. But more importantly, what he brought to the conversation from Freud and Adler's work is that we are spirit. Spirit not in the sense of religious concept, but spirit in the sense of that is what a human is. We are spirit, we have a body, we live in a body, we have a mind, emotions, and so on. And it is through the spirit that we can discover our meaning. We do not create it. It is life who asks us to discover the meaning. And the three broad areas, as our speakers begin to discuss, that logotherapy divides the quest for meaning, the discovery of meaning, is what we can create, what we can experience in our relationship with others, and most importantly, if either of those are not available, our attitude we take toward those experiences. Each of these are unique to the individual. Each of us, as this spiritual being, this noetic dimension, discovers the meaning that life asks for us individually. And of a special topic for today is the ideal that Frankl also discussed, that just by being human, not only do we have this quest for meaning, this motivation within us, each of us will deal with what he called the tragic triad. None of us get to leave this world, if you will, this life, without dealing with pain or suffering, however you want to term it. In conjunction with that, there are also guilt. We can do the very best that we can and still have experiences where looking back, we feel guilty. And the third area is death. Dr. Frankl sees death not as something done to us in the negative sense, but in many ways, maybe you could use the word as a blessing. Because of the concept that we will die, we are forced to recognize that we have a limited amount of time. And because of that, this urgency to fulfill what is meaningful to us becomes much more valid. When we're not able to deal with these, when we're not able to discover the meaning, then the access to the noetic, to the spiritual, can become blocked. And it can result in what Dr. Frankl termed as an existential vacuum. And this very quick overview that I'm going through, the reason I wanted to bring this up is that because I believe because of the pandemic, many more people are struggling with what is the meaning of life. I have no meaning of life. I'm floundering, I'm treading water, sinking, whatever metaphor you want to do. And as a result, I think we're seeing more and more of what Frankl called the neurotic triad. Again, some of the terminology obviously has changed in the last 100 years or so, but we're just beginning to see the effects, the negative effects, and depression and addiction coming through. So with that said, very quickly, I'm going to transcend to the other speakers. And as they go through their different topics, we'll come back and look at how with that tragic triad, especially with the ideal of pain and suffering and death, we will discuss, and in a lesser way, the complex of guilt, but how regardless of the suffering, regardless of the narrative they will be sharing with each of us. And as I transition to Janeta, Dr. Tansey, I will say that our focus today is much more on the narrative and the story. We do have the data, the research backing logotherapy. However, we always put the caveat in, we are more than the research. The human story, the human narrative, the human spirit will always be just beyond what the data can measure. And so in that, we will focus quite strongly today on the narrative. So, Dr. Tansey.
Thanks very much, Cindy. And thank you, Cindy, for letting me participate today. Actually, if you turn off your share screen, I'll put mine up.
All right. If I can figure out how to do that, I will do that.
Okay.
There we go. I think I have it all.
You got it. Okay. Okay. So the topic for this panel was about logotherapy cradle to grave, and I'm talking about the cradle side. And thinking, as Cindy mentioned, that no matter where our origin story is, wherever we're at in the birth process, and I'm going to be thinking a lot about birth in terms of its metaphorical values, we have death in mind. I'm going to look very quickly at three aspects of birth and meiotics. So meiotics meaning the midwife role that I see in logotherapy, with the hope that it would be helpful to understanding logotherapy as it can be used in a variety of clinical practices. I'm going to watch my time here too. Okay. So this is a quote. I should mention, I'm not going to read all my slides to you, but being of a bit of a scholarly bent, I'm kind of a primary source junkie, and I like to put the primary sources up on the slide. So I'm going to dip in and out of them. I'll put my email in the chat afterwards. If anybody wants a copy of the slides to look at these quotes more explicitly, I'll provide that. But some of them I will read, and this is one of the ones that I wanted to read specifically. This is Joseph Fabry, someone who is very important in the logotherapy movement, and his book, The Pursuit of Meaning. He says, no birth is without labor pains, figuratively and literally. The history of creative people is full of tales of pain. It is also questionable whether the moments of bliss in a love relationship could be possible without the labor pains of agony and doubt. Yet no true artist would forego their creations or lovers, their love, because pain is the price. Neither would a mother forego her child because she knows she will have to endure what is probably the most universal human suffering in the world. On the contrary, she is happily suffering pain for the sake of having a child. It is not the load that breaks us down, logotherapy seems to say, but the way we carry it. Patience is sometimes necessary in order to see meaning behind the suffering. So I first wanted to start with the idea that in logotherapy, this idea of birth is very much connected to the phenomenology of where meaning resides in our lives. And so some basic tenets here that I think we can draw from the literature and the logotherapy movement. One is that every person is pregnant with meaning, and not just the person, but the life itself, that meaning is embedded inside of being. That conscience, our conscious, both conscious and unconscious, suffers in its laboring towards our meaning birth. Frankl often talks about the suffering of conscience inside of tension. The birth of meaning can be a dangerous process, and we can miscarry. Things can go terribly wrong. I think those that think of the meaning journey as somehow being all full of sweetness, light, and rainbows often are missing what peril comes as we give birth to our meaning in life, even though we are impregnated with that this can be a challenge. This is relevance for the therapeutic posture. Our meaning babies, and that's my word, these meaning babies that are born, they belong to my life. They are an outgrowth of my own creative spirit, or what Frankl calls the defiant power of the human spirit. Meaning can mature, and we heard this in Paul's comments earlier. It can go vertical. It stretches, it grows, it transcends, it has height. So logotherapy is often thought of as a height psychology, distinguishing it by Frankl's own words from depth psychologies. Also, meaning can be neglected and die. And so sometimes we find our meaning babies, but they get abandoned, and that this can be seen in, for example, the collective neuroses such as fatalism, tranquilization, fanaticism, and other things that Frankl felt strongly contributed to our community suffering and even risked war. I think it's interesting to know, Frankl being classically trained, that this idea of maiutics and birth really dates back to the classics literature. This is one of Plato's dialogues, Theaetetus, in which Socrates is talking to Theaetetus about the discovery of knowledge. And Theaetetus is saying, yeah, it's really hard work. I have feelings of concern about this matter. And Socrates says back to him, yes, you are suffering the pangs of labor, Theaetetus, because you are not empty but pregnant. So we can date this metaphor back quite some ways. Now, in addition to the metaphor of birthing being applicable to meaning, there's also the process in logotherapy of a maieutic posture of the therapist towards those that are laboring for meaning. So that's the second aspect I want to focus on, is how a logotherapist might think about a midwifely or a maieutic posture towards the person that they're working with. So this is back to the Platonic dialogue. Socrates says to Theaetetus, all that is true of their art of midwifery is true also of mine. In this dialogue, he reveals that he is the son of a midwife. So he likes the midwife metaphor. He says the midwives of babies are tending, let's see, I am tending their souls in labor, not their bodies. So that's where Socrates' form of midwifery is different. And he tests in every way whether the mind of a young man is bringing forth a mere image, an imposture, or a real and genuine offspring. But he too warns of the danger of this kind of work, saying that many, after they have gone away, have miscarried thenceforth on account of evil companionship, and the offspring which they had brought forth through my assistance, they have reared so badly that they have lost it. And so emphasizing again that this midwifery posture, which as a reminder, both exists before the meaning baby comes forward, but also afterwards. It's not just the labor pains, it's what comes before and what comes after that is also relevant to the maieutic posture. Frankl noted that tension is important. So as I just want to invite a kind of imagery of the tension that is inside this metaphor of a woman through the birth pains. It's not homeostasis. There's movement, and there's movement through tension. Now, Frankl uses this metaphor of iron filings in a magnetic field of force. Man's life is put in order through his orientation towards meaning. Existential dynamics he talks about. So this is an image that I found of iron filings with two magnets, but it struck me just looking at it, if you could play with me for a bit, that we could also think about it as the energetic fields that exist between the I and the thou, a midwife and her client, but also perhaps of the birth canal. I mean, if we think about this, and I've been fortunate to both deliver babies and to have been in the delivery position myself, that process of the tension and of navigating a baby through the birth canal is not only full of tension, but a tension that needs to be moderated. So what does it mean to be a midwife to this? This is a lovely article by Tanya Staler, who's not a logotherapist, but was interested in a Heideggerian perspective of the phenomenology of midwifery. And she says in her paper, birth requires a special kind of being with as being there. In the best case scenario, midwives reassure us that miracles, or what seems like one due to its inconceivable character, are possible. In the worst case scenario, they can make us want to escape from the situation and from our bodies, neither of which is possible. So we can be good midwives and we can be terrible midwives. And I think this is a cautionary tale for those of us that want to engage in good meiotic work, is that we could do it badly. And if we do it badly, we may really cause harm. And so the excellence of a maieutic posture has a kind of craftsmanship to it, a sensitivity to the patient that's in front of you. Frankl is famous for saying that there can be as many kinds of logotherapy as there are patients. Every patient has its own need. So this is a picture of the labyrinth in my office. I like it. It reminds me a little bit of a womb. And I put alongside of this how I think of a myotic posture, not restricted to logotherapy, but certainly applicable to logotherapy. And in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some specific what we do is what we choose with the other. We do invite responsive plan. So this passive engagement of our client to show up, to do think it's important, just as we do with a laboring woman, that we make space for stillness. In the birthing room, we are listening to the body. In myotic therapy, we are listening for conscience, and not my conscience as a therapist, but the conscience of the client. We adjust. Just like in the birthing room, we might turn a mama on her side. We are adjusting to facilitate the birthing. You have to be patient. Fabry said that at the beginning quote. We have to be patient with the process. We all have heard of the situations in which a mama comes in with Braxton Hicks. She's sent back home. It's not time to have the baby yet. Anytime we get into a rush, we have the risk of miscarriage when our agenda starts to trump the process that our client is working through. And finally, we have to let go of attachment. I think there's a lot of desire by therapists that we know the meaning baby that's going to be born. And that's a problem. The meaning baby belongs to the client. It doesn't belong to us. And so it's very important to think about how we are not going to be attached to what is brought forth. It belongs to the client. Now, what's unique about logotherapy midwifery? In logotherapy, we think about the healthy baby as being an element of the noetic dimensions of the human spirit. So this is not just a behavioral plan. It's not just a cognitive aspect. It is about the human spirit. And in logotherapy, we think not only of the health of the parent as a whole person engaging this process, but just as we saw in the Platonic dialogue, we're very interested in that meaning baby going forward. How is that meaning baby going to grow up as opposed to being neglected? How is that meaning baby going to have siblings, new meaning babies that come to enliven the family of meanings that this particular client is working with? Like other therapies, but certainly true to logotherapy, there is a deep openness to the other's conscience. This is a highly receptive and listening posture in the examination room. There are certain attitudes of joy and good humor. Frankl is famous in his work for his use of irony and even some gallows humor at times as a way of provoking the movement of the laboring pains. There is an aspect of examination, just like a midwife might be examining the fundal height of a pregnancy or measuring the cervical dilation. The myotic logotherapist is examining the process for what's going on. Where is there progress? Where is there not progress? Where are we stuck? Where do we need an adjustment? And logotherapists use techniques. Just like a midwife would use certain kinds of techniques in the birthing room to ease the process or to manage the pain, we use techniques in logotherapy, which include, among others, the Socratic Dialogue, de-reflection, and paradoxical intention. All of them, though, are intended not as techniques per se, but rather a way of facilitating conscience. This is another really lovely piece, not from the logotherapy canon, but this is a philosopher writing about the use of midwifery in Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. We know Nietzsche was highly influential of Frankl's own work. And he points out that we have this problem out there with sophistry in the classic tradition, but still today. He says, along the lines of the Socratic analogy to midwifery, the sophist does not assist his students in their labor, but instead gives birth himself to truths he then hands over to those willing to pay for them, a black market dealer in newborn nuggets of wisdom. We have a lot of this in our culture and spaces in which people literally are self-help gurus and they hand over meaning options. That's not logotherapy. Logotherapy is looking for the individual client to do the work of their unique meanings. Now, just a little piece of history, which I just find fascinating. Rollo May made a strong criticism of logotherapy and Frankl. In 1961, he feared that logotherapy hovers close to authoritarianism. It seems as if the patient cannot find his goal, that Frankl supplies him with one. Well, in his 1975 edition to Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning, the chapter, he directly addresses this, and it's relevant to myeutics. Frankl says logotherapy is neither teaching nor preaching. This is not sophistry. We don't hand out newborn nuggets of wisdom. The logotherapist does not, as Rollo May, supply the patient with the goal. If he ever has, he was no logotherapist. The logotherapist leaves it to the patient to decide what is meaningful and what is not, or for that matter, what is good or bad. This echoed comments he made even in The Doctor and the Soul. So this was not a new position of his. That's not to say that looking at his work, the question of technique, right? We might have the intention to be myetic, but how do we practice that in our techniques at the bedside? And that's always a challenge because we are people with thoughts, with ideas. We're trying to be helpful. The Socratic Dialogue as a technique, this is Fabry's work, is a process of helping patients give birth to their unconscious goals. In the Socratic Dialogue, the therapist poses questions in such a way that patients become aware of their unconscious decisions, repressed hopes, and their unadmitted self-knowledge. Maybe we'll move on just a little bit quickly so I can just wrap up here. Frankl does say, though, that there is the possibility that my conscience errs. So one of the reasons in the myetic space that we have humility and modesty is because we can get it wrong. We can get it wrong as therapists. The clients might be laboring and getting it wrong themselves. So Frankl makes a distinction between indifference, where we just say everybody's right. That's not the logotherapy view, and instead to practice tolerance. In closing, let me just share Elizabeth Lucas from her book, Logotherapy Principles and Methods. She says, Joseph Van Eichendorff has composed a song verse about what I have tried to illustrate in these brief case studies. It goes like this. In all things, there is a sleeping song which they dream on, and the world begins to sing as soon as you speak the magic word. Yes, the magic word. Here is what I realized after 25 years of practice. We psychotherapists have no magic word. Think about this in terms of technique, right? We're in the moment, but our patients have one in themselves, and they begin to sing when guided by methods, intuitions, or otherwise we speak it. They begin to sing. And so I think of our singing meaning babies, and then singing of our lives. This is the logotherapy hope and a myetic practice. Okay, I'm going to hand it off. Gail.
Thank you, Janeta. Wonderful. All right, I will share my screen. So just a little bit of, let me just put this in the presenting mode. I've decided to concentrate in just this brief little presentation on persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And the reason being that I've spent the past 30 years sharing my life with people, and that would include the family that my husband and I have had together, and that's the beginning picture right there. And even though it's a beautiful picture and it's wonderful and people are smiling, in the process of the past 30 years, we certainly have experienced everything as a family. But what's really kept us grounded and going, just a sec, gotta go back, is the fact that we share our life and that we have others that we take care of. So maybe somebody can tell me, how do I keep this to just on one screen at a time? All right.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I just do it this way?
Sure.
So I don't, okay, so it's going to do it this way. So people with intellectual and development disabilities have quite a history, and people, you may be familiar with it and maybe not, but in a very brief nutshell, the Vermont State Hospital is where I actually met my husband. And we were both working in a program that was geared towards getting the developmentally disabled adults out into the community because the law had changed. And these are people who had lived in the state hospital for most of their life. And so for a lot of them, they were in their 40s, 50s, and it was a very, very violent place. It was what would be known as a snake pit. It was a very intense work. And for me, it was very different than the restaurant work that I had been accustomed to. but it also became my life. And that's not an unusual picture, the day hall picture. For me, the day hall, I worked on the men's unit. The men were mostly naked and very violent and out of control. Nobody saw them as persons. And that was one of the things that I would come to realize and to make it sort of a mission to change. So the first person here, this is Colette. We've been living together for almost 24 years. Colette was one of the last 4 people to leave the Laconia State School in New Hampshire. And the reason she couldn't leave is because they couldn't find a home for her because she was very violent. Here's a picture of her with her mom, who loved her very dearly, but was pressured to give her up because in those days there was not a lot of support and help. And so she was pretty much forced to put Colette in an institution. So over the years, here's a picture with one of my daughters where they're eating together. Colette, I have a daughter who was born after Colette came. And so for the last group of kids that I had, they all grew up with Colette and thinking that she was just part of our family, which indeed she was. She spent the first 5 years being very violent in our home, but my husband and I were both experienced. And through 5 years of just hanging in there with her, we did not use any behavior management because that's the thing we had been trained in. Behaviorism was very unholy, very demeaning, and very not about relationship. So what we did was a variety of other things, but mostly let her know that we were there for her through thick or thin, through anger or not anger, and that she could trust us. And after about 5 years, she really calmed down and she started relaxing and she started melding more of herself into the family. So it's this other person over here, Priscilla, was another woman who had lived with us prior to Colette coming with us. She had been with us for about 5 years, and then she went on to live with another person. Here's Colette, and down here during the pandemic, she couldn't see an eye doctor, and she was just about blind. So at one point we tried glasses. She liked them, but I don't think they helped her very much. But as soon as we could get her into the doctors, we did, and she had cataract surgery on both eyes, and she could see again for the first time in a while. And here she is just participating with us. She's wheelchair bound now. She has very little verbal skills, but I think what really matters about Colette is that she's an extremely delightful person. We love her dearly. She loves us. And people don't even notice her when they come in our house. She's invisible. And that is not unlike other people that have disabilities. But for Colette, yeah, she has a lot of meaning to her life. And yes, I may be a voice for her, but I can do that after spending all these years together with her of what she likes, what she doesn't like. She loves her brother and sister who visit her from time to time. She loves babies. She loves the dogs. She loves to hold a baby. She likes to watch life. And since the time she's been with us, her vocabulary has expanded tremendously, and she's very rarely acts out on anything now. And we've become, for her family, that's true, but she's our family, and we've learned from her. This is a picture that was taken many years ago, but here's Colette. My mom lived with us too. We had built an addition on our home and took care of my mom and dad. And so you can see these are my children, and everybody's grown up living, sharing, caring, and finding out what their purpose is has been a lot easier, I think, in some ways, because it was true from the beginning of what gave our lives meaning. This is Nick. Nick has lived with us for going on 9 years. Nick came to us, we tell him we were his birthday present. He came on his 21st birthday when he aged out of an institution in New Hampshire. They had looked for a home for him for 1.5 years, and nobody would accept him. And so they called us, and we actually weren't really, I say we weren't open. We weren't feeling like doing anything more, but we just said, okay, well, we met him. He was 240 pounds. He has a genetic disorder called Prader-Willi or Prader-Willi, which is a chromosomal disorder on the 15th chromosome. He is never feels satisfied from food. He never feels any kind of state. He's not sated at all. So it's always a hunger and always a searching. So he came to us, and over the course of a couple of years, he was able to get down to, he's the average weight now is about 105 pounds. He no longer food searches, which is very unusual for people with Prader-Willi, very unusual, but we're thinking it's because he knows he belongs. That his dad died 2 years ago. He has no family. We're it. And I think that as much as we've gone through, and it's been a lot because he has psychoses, he can be extremely violent and run away. But over the course of the last many years, you know, we look at each other as persons. He has choices in his life. He weighs those choices. He makes decisions, good or bad, but he lives with it if it's not a good decision. And it's just become about relationship and belonging. And he's found a home, and that matters. And that matters to him. And ask him about meaning in his life, and he will tell you a whole story, because he's alive and he's verbal and he's got so much to look forward to, and he's very, very proud. Oh, and where would I be without mentioning Andre? Andre is the baby of our family. We call him baby number 2 because when we told our family our kids we were having another baby, the then baby of the family, who was 2 years old, said, "No, I'm the baby." So Andre has come along, and Andre, you ask him, "Are you the baby?" And he says, "No, I'm baby number 2," because he let Antonia be baby number 1, and she still is a bit of a baby. But this is Andre. Family, I did find out before he was born that he had Down syndrome. My husband didn't care to know because he knew he was just going to treat him like whoever he was. And we had shared with each other before we decided to have a baby, worst fears. His worst fear was that he was going to lose me during the process. I'm a little bit older when Andre was born, and I laughed at that. What's my worst fear? I said, "Well, I'm afraid he's going to have a disability." And he laughed at that. He said, "You know, that's what our whole life has been. What are you afraid of?" So here he comes. Here comes Andre. And Andre has grown up, and he is probably the sweetest kid in the whole world. He got sick at 3, got very sick. He almost died at 3. But we nursed him through that and came back. And he's just the beloved of the family. Now, kind of bringing this to a logo, I like to consider this a logo philosophical point of view. I was in psychiatric research with Dartmouth Hitchcock Psychiatric Research Group, and for a few years, and we worked on health and wellness for people with serious mental illness. But I had suggested to them time and time again, I said, we actually really need to be thinking about meaning, because it really just wasn't there. The pilot studies and the studies weren't quite gelling with any long-term results. But in the process of that, I asked if I could do a pilot study with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so I wrote it, and we did it. We did a pilot study with 10 individuals on health and wellness. And I have to, just quickly share that what we discovered was an intense loneliness, intense isolation, and intense loneliness. And it's probably the most underserved population that we have in this country. So just wrapping it up, life has meaning for all persons, in utero till deathbed, and a combination, I think, of Franklian principles and family. And then we have joy through all the suffering that everybody brings to the table. So I guess that's my part.
All right. My name's Jared Bishop, and I am here and I work mental treatment center of mental health issues. But what we see quite frequently with very many of our kids is issues with complex trauma. There we go. I'm going to this is our mission, if anyone is interested. But Van der Kolk defined complex trauma as the experience of multiple or chronic and prolonged developmentally adverse traumatic events, most often of an interpersonal nature, for example, sexual abuse, war, or community violence, and with an early life onset. As this definition points out, the impact of complex trauma is developmentally adverse. It affects cognitive, social, and identity development. And so our avenues for discovering meaning in life become constricted. If we're thinking of complex or trauma as kind of a pathway, simple trauma, we have a one traumatic event, even though it's still a complex issue to deal with, the path is much more straightforward. For the kids I work with, it looks like this kind of cityscape. But when we're thinking about how meaning can become constricted for these kids, we think of typical psychosocial development becoming impaired because from the very earliest years, the world is viewed as an unsafe place, and the individuals who populate the world are untrustworthy and unhelpful. As these young people begin to explore their identity and their place in the world, these early life experiences play a role in how they orient themselves toward a meaningful existence. For typically developing children, their creative acts, their efforts in school are praised and encouraged, and that contributes to further successes. For our youth who have experienced complex trauma, at best, their creative contributions are ignored. At worst, they're denigrated. And that joy that comes from creating and giving to life is taken from them. In their relationships, for typically developing children, they have positive, warm, encouraging experiences of love and closeness from individuals who care about them. Very often for our youth with complex trauma, these relationships have been empty of such love and have been tainted by inconsistent care. Relationships become something that are painful, something to be guarded against. Or we have youth who desperately cling to relationships that are shallow or abusive in nature. And so in the experiential values, they've become distorted. Chronic maltreatment also makes it difficult for these youth to find meaning in suffering because suffering has been all that they've ever known. It should come as no surprise that as childhood exposure to trauma increases, so do incidents of depression, aggression, and addiction, which is Frankl's Neurotic Triad. Beyond these existential and developmental concerns, individuals who have experienced complex trauma often respond to life events with hyperarousal or hypoarousal. For our hyperaroused individuals, they're perpetually in the state of fight or flight. Danger is perceived to be everywhere due to sensitivity to external stimuli. And so they experience a lot of difficulty regulating their emotions, controlling their impulses. They're always on edge. At the other end of the spectrum, we have kids with hypoarousal. They've retreated within themselves into a fantasy world or detached from any emotion. They're really immobilized by a deep-seated fear. And this fear is a really defining feature of this complex trauma. Not just a fear of trauma memories and reminders, but a fear of attachment, of success, of forming a strong positive identity. So I want to talk a little bit about my clinical work and how I approach this. It is quite a challenge, but it is such a great opportunity to make a lasting difference for a kid. So I tend to start with what Fabry's stage of self-distancing. Self-distancing from our symptoms. Development of good rapport is absolutely essential, but the therapist has to provide the client with an opportunity to learn that they are more than their symptoms. So many labels have been thrown at them over the years that have stuck and that they've accepted as part of who they are. I had a client several years ago who was very resistant to therapy, very resistant to even medication, anything like that, because his anger, his isolation, his aggression was part of who he was. And so even being involved in therapy was an attack on his identity. Labels have been tossed around, hurtful comments, and those statements and labels are gradually accepted by these kids. And so as Dr. Tansey said, slowly the work goes slowly, but we work to develop a sense of identity that's separate from those symptoms. Elizabeth Lucas, I like the way she described it. We're leading these youth to see themselves as outside observers, not from their traps as victims. The second step Fabry described is the modification of attitudes. I think this is also where a lot of the logotherapy work happens. This is where a lot of the myotic questioning that Dr. Tansey talked about comes in. Clients, even the most damaged and abused, has the heal themselves. And I think this is the great defiant power of the human spirit. But we're guides. We guide them to new perspectives about themselves, their identity, their past traumas. And while the trauma cannot be changed, their attitudes towards the past and its present can be modified. I think of the Frankl's triad of pain, guilt, and death. It's all unavoidable suffering, and many times very present in the kids I work with. Often there's a lack of awareness of how that past trauma is impacting their present reality, and an avoidance of really talking about or facing any of the past trauma. But that's still a very important barrier to overcome. I forget who I got this phrase from, but I really liked it. Of when we avoid the monsters, we make them stronger. And it's such a metaphor that I use often with the kids I work with. And Frankl echoes this sentiment that pain, guilt, and death can never be explained away, but it's important to face them directly in therapy. From this awareness, hopefully kids are able to adopt an attitude of responsibility to not being defined by their past, but taking responsible for how they are going to respond to it. Symptom reduction, we address symptoms that have not abated in the first two steps, and then we orient towards meaning in the future. We got one more slide. One more minute left, so I'm going to just talk very briefly about, with teenagers, this involves a whole lot of creativity. Getting into superheroes, which is one of my favorite areas to incorporate into therapy work. A lot of my kids are really into manga, but using what they're interested in. Popular characters are great tools for self-distancing, stepping out of themselves, and the meaning and purpose in their life. Sanctuary therapy, music therapy, art therapy are all great tools. So I would just encourage you, hopefully planted some ideas, inspired some things to consider as you work with kids and individuals of all ages and finding meaning. So.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wimberly, and your team for such a rich and hopeful discussions on this topic. And thank you for your generosity for sharing your contact information for the attendees to contact you for slides. And as you can see, a lot of people appreciated this discussion and the sharing. Thank you.
If I could just maybe add a little conclusion, maybe close the parentheses. One of the things that I hope that has came across in each of these is suffering is universal. Regardless of the life that we choose or we think we're choosing, there will be suffering. Again, the pandemic has shared that globally. But the message is, it's not because of the suffering, but in spite of the suffering, there is always the opportunity to discover the meaning. And it's when we can discover the meaning that life gives us the opportunity to live beyond that pain, that suffering. So.
Thank you. I hope you can enjoy the other keynotes following this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.